So I'm going to be talking about the methods of philosophy in these 10 lectures. And of course, the methods of philosophy are the ways in which philosophy achieves its aims. So in effect, the question that I'm going to be answering is, at least partially, is how does philosophy achieve its aims? I mean, obviously that question has a presupposition. It's presupposing that philosophy can achieve its aims, and that also raises the question of what philosophy is and what its aims are, so that we can understand how they're related. So I should say just something very briefly about that. I mean, the first thing to say about the word philosophy is that it's used in many ways. I mean, it's quite often here, for example, footballers talking about their philosophy of football, or cooks talking about their philosophy of cooking, and so on. And they don't mean much more than their general attitude to it. And I think that the application of the term philosophy has been subject to all kinds of historical contingencies, and I don't think that we're going to find anything very useful in some kind of abstract definition of it. I think the definition is most likely to be incorrect in one way or another, and probably also just as much in need of explanation as the term philosophy itself. I think we have some ability to recognize what counts as philosophy and what does not, and that's enough for us to get started. I think as we go on, you'll see more about how I understand what philosophy is, but I'm not proposing to give you an exact definition, and I don't think there is a good exact definition of it. But I will give, just to orient these lectures a bit, I'll give you some sense of the way I'm understanding it. So I'm understanding it as a science, but not a natural science. I mean, it's not a natural science in the way that physics and biology, for example, are natural sciences. I think as these lectures go on, you will see better just what I mean by that. And my view, which is a controversial one. Sorry, somebody needs to mute their themselves. So, I mean, my view is that sciences aim at knowledge. Of course, that's controversial. And again, as these lectures go on, I think how I'm understanding that will become clearer. And so, I mean, given those partial clarifications, the questions that I was raising before about how philosophy achieves its aims, or whether it can, become the questions of how philosophy achieves knowledge, and indeed whether philosophy can achieve knowledge. And again, it will be the lectures themselves that give my answer to those questions. So I'll just briefly mention what the topics of the lectures will be one by one. So in each of them is about philosophy in connection with something. And so we've got philosophy and common sense, which is today, philosophy and disagreement, which will be the next lecture, philosophy and clarification, philosophy and thought experiments, philosophy and theory comparison, philosophy and logic, philosophy and the history of philosophy, its past, philosophy and its neighbors, by which I mean its neighboring disciplines. I mean, philosophy overlaps with many different other disciplines, or has a common border with them. And then philosophy and models, and philosophy and its future, the future of philosophy. So in this lecture, I'm start with the question of where philosophy starts, that one could understand two different questions. I mean, what one is where philosophy starts for a particular individual, and the other is where philosophy starts for a whole culture. So if we're talking about an individual, they may become aware of philosophy as philosophy through being introduced to it by others, for example, by teachers or friends, as some sort of philosophical tradition which they can in some way participate in, or at least find out about. But that seems, as it were, a little bit late in a sense, because it seems quite a natural idea that that many children spontaneously ask questions which somehow already have some kind of philosophical character to them. And of course, well, in English, these questions are typically of the form, why this or why that? And I mean, there's a stage at which children ask these why questions about almost everything. I mean, I've heard a child on the bus asking their parent where the bus went to and being told it goes to Clapham, and then the child asking why. And of course, I mean, that's not an especially philosophical question, but many of these why questions that children ask do have some kind of philosophical character to them. And in fact, it's been said that that all normal human beings go through a phase of asking why questions, and most people grow out of that, but some people never do, and the ones who never do grow out of that phase are the philosophers. So I want to suggest that, as it were, that philosophy is something that we can get to quite naturally without having, at least in some form, without having contact with a philosophical tradition. And part of what I'm going to talk about in this first lecture is what sort of cognitive basis philosophy needs to get started. What kind of cognitive equipment do we need to have to do some philosophy? I mean, to get, as it were, to get beyond merely asking these why questions or what questions or whatever they happen to be. And so I think a natural answer to that question might be that that philosophy starts with common sense, with something that is widely shared, not with some special unusual characteristic of the individual. And so I'm going to explain how I'm understanding common sense here. So when I describe something as common sense, I'm not implying that it's universal to all human beings or all normal human beings or something like that. I'm quite content for common sense to be something which varies with the individual's social group and also with their historical period, so that what's common sense in one group may not be common sense in another, and what's common sense at one time may not be common sense at another time. And in particular, what I mean by common sense knowledge is simply widely shared knowledge in that relevant group. And so just some random examples of common sense knowledge, and knowledge that rice is edible, that it can be eaten, knowledge that cats are not dogs, knowledge that there are mountains in China, and knowledge of what common words mean. So with the knowledge that rice is edible, that cats are not dogs, that there are mountains in China, this knowledge is very widespread in many communities, but it's not a human universal, because some groups of humans have never encountered rice, so they don't, and some have never encountered cats or dogs, and some have never heard of China. Maybe not so many these days who have never heard of these things, but in the past there were many groups like that. And knowledge of what common words mean, of course, the particular knowledge that's in question here is knowledge of what particular words mean, and so that depends on what language you happen to speak or to understand, which of course varies very much from one community to another. I mean, of course, it's common to human beings to have knowledge of what the words of their own language mean. I mean, that's almost pretty much a human universal, at least amongst all normal humans. But the particular knowledge that makes it up varies according to the language. But I don't want to confine common sense to knowledge. I also want to have a notion of common sense belief, by which I mean similarly widely shared belief in the relevant community. And so in ancient times, I assume that the belief that the earth was flat was a common sense belief. It was widely shared. And I mean, if you have a religious society, then a society, let's say, dominated by one religion in particular, then the beliefs associated with that religion will count as common sense beliefs within that religious society. And I also want to extend the notion of common sense to cognitive methods, and in the same way as before. So cognitive, methods, common sense methods, if they're widely shared in the relevant community. And to talk at a fairly generic level, the kind of examples we might think of are sense perception, which is a method for acquiring knowledge or belief, memory as a method for preserving knowledge or belief, and testimony as a method for communicating knowledge or belief to other people. And by the way, notice that although sense perception is a common sense method, the particular knowledge or belief that we get by sense perception often won't count as common sense by the definition that I gave, because, for example, when I look around, I get knowledge about where the objects on my desk are, and by sense perception. But since I'm not sharing that knowledge with anyone else, that knowledge is not itself common sense knowledge, although it's acquired by a common sense means. And so I've defined common sense in this way as in order to avoid making contentious assumptions here. So I'm allowing that common sense beliefs can be false. So common sense in that way is fallible. Of course, common sense knowledge can't be false, because it's just a part of the nature of knowledge that whatever is known is true. But that's that, as a guarantee of truth, is coming from the fact that it's knowledge. It's not coming from the fact that it's common sense. And so, well, we've already had some examples of false common sense beliefs. So, talking about some ancient community, the false common sense belief that the Earth was flat, that it was common sense because it was widely shared, even though it was false. But it was not a common sense knowledge because it wasn't knowledge at all. Of course, the people in that ancient community might have thought that, it might have been that it was common sense knowledge that the Earth was flat, but they were wrong about that. And if they all thought that, then that was another false common sense belief about the epistemological status of their belief that the Earth was flat. I should just say, people sometimes challenge this assumption that that knowledge has to be true, but I think the kind of examples that people sometimes use against that assumption are based on a misunderstanding of quite a common way that we use language. So, you might hear somebody saying something like, of course, in ancient times, people knew that the Earth was flat. But I think what they're doing when they say that is using words, in particular the word know or knew, in a kind of projective way where they're putting things as the people that they're talking about would put them. And that kind of projective use is very, very common. It's since the people in the ancient community, they thought they knew that the Earth was flat, and so we're using the term know projectively to describe their point of view. But this is something that you can do with more or less any word. For example, if I'm describing a meal, I could say something like I saw a glass of water and had a drink from it, and then suddenly I realized that it wasn't water; it was whiskey or something. And so that's a projective use of the word water being applied to whiskey, and it's projective because at the time I thought that it was water, even though it wasn't. That's not some kind of ambiguity in the word water. It's simply the fact that we can use the word water projectively, and we sometimes use the word knowledge projectively, and that can give the appearance, if the phenomenon is misinterpreted, the appearance that there's such a thing as false knowledge. But as I say, that's just a misinterpretation of projective uses of language. So now, having given that kind of sketch of how I'm understanding common sense, I want to discuss its relation to philosophy. So I'm not suggesting that everyone with lots of common sense knowledge and belief is a philosopher, even in a sort of relatively loose and informal sense. I mean, somebody can have lots of common sense knowledge and belief just by having quite a lot of just very normal awareness of their natural and social world, while not being at all reflective on it. And so, as it were, we need something a bit more than just common sense to get philosophy started. And I think the natural answer to the question of what more we need is curiosity. By curiosity, I mean the appetite for knowledge. So I should just say something quickly about why I use a slightly unusual term appetite rather than just calling it a desire or a want. The reason for that is that describing it as a desire implies that the person who has the desire is, if it's a desire for knowledge, they're thinking of it as knowledge. So as it were, it's as if they were thinking, I'd like some knowledge. I think that's over-intellectualizing what curiosity is. And as you see, I think that curiosity is a feature which very young children, before they have any language, have, and which non-human animals have. And those non-human animals, they might not have any, as it were, conception of knowledge, but they still have an appetite for it. They're still, as it were, disposed to do things to acquire knowledge. And in the same way as they might have an appetite for food and drink, but without necessarily, as it were, characterizing what it is they want as food or drink. So in describing it as an appetite for knowledge, I'm not implying anything especially intellectual or reflective on the part of the curious agent. So humans typically express curiosity by asking questions. For example, what is this in front of me? But as I just emphasized, the ability to express one's curiosity in language is not essential for curiosity itself. So very young children and many species of non-human animals can be curious. I think cats and dogs, for example, are pretty obviously curious animals. I mean, if you just have to watch them sniffing about to see how curious they are. And I don't think this is some kind of weird, as it were, philosopher's projection of philosophical interests onto languageless animals. It's rather that this is something that's not at all surprising from an ordinary evolutionary perspective. And I mean, the point is that it's often not clear in advance what sorts of knowledge will come in useful. So creatures who know a lot about their environment, they for example, they have a kind of map of their local environment and where things are and how to get from one part of it to another and so on. And maybe who also have quite a bit of knowledge about other members of whatever group or pack they belong to. They can use that knowledge to react quickly and appropriately to dangers and opportunities. So, for example, I mean, they will be able to know where other members of their group are and where the members of other species are, maybe members that they might eat, of another species that they might eat or that might eat them, and so on. And it's to their advantage not to have to find these things out once it becomes the knowledge becomes of practical use. It's much better and quicker and more efficient and perhaps life-saving if you already have that knowledge available. And that's really very closely related to what one might think of as the evolutionary advantage of having a mind at all, because, I mean, presumably in very rough terms, the advantage of having a mind is that it enables one to adapt one's behavior to new circumstances in some kind of complex and unpredictable world. And so, as it were, the point of having knowledge is that one acts on it one acts on it in appropriate ways. And so getting that knowledge in advance, as it were, before things become urgent or an emergency, has obvious survival value. So that's why it's completely unsurprising that curiosity as the appetite for knowledge is widespread in the animal world, including amongst lots of animals that don't have language. But for creatures who do have language, the language enables us to construct more abstract questions, to construct them and to ask them And so it enables us to become curious about more abstract matters, which we couldn't really mentally engage with if we didn't have something like a language to do it in. Now, of these somewhat more abstract questions that we can ask, some are proto-scientific. In other words, they seem to be taking a step in the direction of a scientific interest in the world. And I mean, just to take some random examples that occurred to me, these could be questions like, what is water? What is earth? What is air? What is fire? What is light? What are things made of? Maybe what makes some things good to eat or drink and others bad? What makes things fall down, not up? So these are questions which, once you have the words to ask them with, and you have some kind of curiosity, it's very easy to ask. And these are questions which, might well occur to a child to ask. A child might ask questions like this of its parents. But there are also questions which are proto-philosophical, in the sense that asking them seems to be taking a step towards philosophy. So for example, you might ask, are there things we can't see? Perhaps even a little bit more abstractly, are there things which can't be seen? Which could just be a question of, concerning things too small to be seen, for example, but it could also lead to reflections on something like, for example, whether numbers can be seen. And you could ask questions like, what is space? What is time? What is life? What is death? What makes the difference between waking and sleeping? What makes the difference between seeing and imagining? What makes the difference between knowing and thinking? What makes some things good and others bad? Or what is fairness? And these are really questions which, it would be possible for a child to ask. And I expect that some children have asked these questions. And they all seem to be questions which are at least on a road that leads to philosophy. There's already something like a philosophical character to them. And one observation to make about this is that although I've separated those questions into two lists, one of the proto-scientific questions and one of the proto-philosophical ones, I don't think that someone just naively asking those questions would be likely to be aware of any very systematic difference between those two. I doubt that they would think of them as different kinds of question. That they feel as though they're all of the same rather broad sort. And in fact, there are a lot of questions which could easily appear on both lists. For example, the question, what is time, is a question which has certainly been asked within philosophy, but it's also a question which which physicists are legitimately interested in. And I don't think that, at least in as were the early stages of this sort of inquiry, that there's somehow they mean different things by these questions. That it's broadly the same question being asked either in a philosophical context or a scientific, natural scientific one. And then something that I just want to mention here, although its real significance will become more obvious in some of the later lectures, that if somebody has the idea that philosophical questions are somehow conceptual, whereas scientific questions are empirical, it's completely unnatural to try to classify those questions which I've listed, as some of them as empirical and other ones as conceptual. For example, it's completely unnatural to think that the question, what is time, as it might be asked in this naive way, could be a question about the concept of time or the word time or anything like that. It seems that, as it were, whether we think of it as a proto-philosophical or proto-scientific question, it's naturally understood as a question about time itself, not about the concept of time or about the experience of time, but time itself. So that at least when we look at the origins of philosophy and science in this sort of common sense curiosity, there's no basis for distinguishing between empirical proto-scientific questions and conceptual proto-philosophical ones. That distinction just is completely inappropriate for these kind of questions. Another point that I want to bring out is that if we imagine Stone Age people trying to answer those questions, or for that matter, young children trying to answer them, what do they have to go on? Well, nothing really very much except common sense knowledge or belief, and maybe common sense methods as well. But it also doesn't seem that common sense knowledge or belief and common sense methods are very likely to take them far in answering those questions. And one feature of curiosity is that it can drive us to ask questions even when we have no idea how to go about answering them. For example, I think people were asking the question, what is time, long before they had any real idea of what might be an appropriate method for answering that question. I mean, they were asking it in a way because they were in the habit of asking questions, and the language that they possessed enabled them to formulate it. And I think that's important because you sometimes see metaphysics and as it were more metaphysical or theoretical ways of doing philosophy criticized on the basis that people are asking questions without really any idea how to answer them. And I don't think we should regard that kind of curiosity as such a bad thing, because after all, if we think there's something worthwhile about natural science, I take it that natural science was rooted in curiosity-driven questions, which when they were first asked, people had no idea how to answer. But by asking them, they provided motivation to find ways of answering them. And in the long run, of course, that has led them to answers to many of those questions. And in fact, those were some of, in a way, the best questions that human beings have ever asked. So that the fact that we don't really know how to answer at least many of these questions, it is not a reason for not asking them. It's a reason for seeking methods that will help us to answer them. So those are some remarks about the relation between common sense and how philosophy starts. But obviously, the fact that philosophy may start with common sense, as we're all we have to answer these questions, that doesn't mean that it also has to end with common sense. And well, the obvious comparison is with science itself, which I think, like philosophy, and in a way, in perhaps the very same series of developments, started with common sense and with curiosity-driven questions, but certainly science goes way beyond common sense, and scientific theories often end up coming to conclusions which seem to be violations of common sense. For example, with quantum mechanics and special relativity. So the question I now want to turn to is what role, if any, common sense has in philosophy as it develops beyond its start, whether common sense has a continuing role in philosophy. So, I mean, one line of thought is that common sense has a very important role, even once philosophy has already got started, and perhaps a role that it should never stop playing. And that is, it seems like a good way to stop philosophy going crazy. So just to take an example of the kind of philosophical theory which is a violation of common sense. I mean, take a philosophical theory which implies that everything except fundamental physics is an illusion. I mean, that's a view which, quite a number of philosophers seem to have, and typically philosophers who describe themselves as naturalists of a fairly hardline kind. And the fact that that's a theory like that is ringing alarm bells with common sense may be alerting us to something that is genuinely problematic about a theory like that. So, after all, the idea of an illusion is not itself part of some fundamental physical theory. I mean, they don't talk about illusions because because illusions have to do with things appearing other than they are, and the fundamental physics doesn't talk about that, because of that the idea of an illusion requires some kind of mind that is the victim of the illusion, and fundamental physics doesn't talk about that. So that there might in the end be something self-defeating about extreme theories of that, and it's something that that common sense alerts us to, and it may also be playing this kind of role in natural science to some extent. So, I mean, there's something problematic about a theory of physics, let's say, which implies that there are no observers, because the danger is that such a theory of physics is undermining itself by apparently being inconsistent with the possibility of the observational evidence that it's supposed to be based on. And of course, observational evidence itself relies ways of level. It relies on sense perception, ultimately. And so it seems like a natural thought that, as it were, we never completely grow out of common sense, because we need it as a check to stop our theories losing all touch with reality. But at the same time, there are some very obvious worries about that view, and this goes back to the point that I was making earlier, that that some common sense beliefs are false, and so as I mean, that suggests a reflection. Well, we're not safe in relying on common sense, because it can lead us into error, and we might have the worry that that common sense much more generally just consists of out-of-date prejudices. I mean, Bertrand Russell is supposed to have described it as common sense as the metaphysics of savages. And then if we're using common sense as a check on philosophical or scientific theories, so that we reject those which are inconsistent with common sense, then the danger is that we never escape from those prejudices, because the methodological role of common sense would mean that that it's excluding theories which reject common sense, and this kind of concern also goes with the thought that perhaps common sense beliefs are useful but not true, that they help us get through life in some way, but that the fact that they're useful doesn't entail that they're true. And of course, the idea of a belief that is useful but not true, I mean, that's a genuine possibility. And perhaps one example is that it may be useful for people to somewhat overestimate themselves, to believe that they're cleverer and more popular and so on than they really are, because those kind of over-optimistic beliefs about themselves are motivating and and keep people happy and make them more likely to succeed. If you're self-confident, then you're more likely to get away with things, and so on. So that, I mean, it certainly is possible to have beliefs which are useful but not true. And then, of course, the kind of worry that it's not unnatural to have about common sense is that maybe that's the situation with common sense much more generally. And then the thought the question occurs to us, well, if we can't rely on common sense, what evidence can we use to support our theories in science and philosophy? If common sense isn't a source of evidence, what is? And I think there's a popular and very widespread answer to that, which is something like this, that your evidence just consists of appearances to you. So, for example, suppose you've done some experiment in which, well, maybe let's say some metal rod are expanded. Then on this view that your evidence just consists of appearances, your evidence does not include the fact that this rod are expanded. Your evidence only includes the fact that it appeared to you that are expanded. And so the thing is, whether it did or did not expand, at least it appeared to you that it expanded, and that's why the evidence that you have just concerns the appearance. And if we develop this view just a little bit, what it suggests is that theories just have to preserve the appearances. In other words, well, at best to explain why things appear that way. For example, why the rod appeared to expand, or at least, even if they don't explain them, at least be consistent with their appearing that way. But it says that theories do not also have to vindicate the appearances in the sense of explaining why things really are that way, the way they appear. For example, explaining why rod did expand, because maybe it didn't, or maybe it only appeared to. Or even if they don't, then, and explain it, there is not even a requirement on this view that theories are at least consistent with things really being the way that they appear. Theories can simply deny that things are the way they appear. And the underlying motivation for this view is that we are fallible about whether things are the way they appear to us, but we're not fallible about whether they appear to us that way. That's the advantage that these appearances are supposed to have, that we're not fallible in the way, we're not fallible about them in the way that we're fallible about, as it were, the reality that their appearances of. Now, if that motivation is right, what it's requiring is that we have infallible sources of evidence, sources which can't present us with anything that's false as evidence, because, as well, these facts about appearances are still going to be true, even if the appearances themselves are illusory. And what I briefly want to do is to explain the problem for that view of evidence. And the main problem for it is that the motivation for the view fails because we're fallible about appearances too. And there are at least three aspects to that fallibility, maybe more. But so the first kind of fallibility concerning appearances is this, that pretty obviously, I am fallible about appearances to you, and you are fallible about appearances to me, which we can call the problem of communication. And I mean, this is pretty obvious because when I rely on how things appear to you, I'm doing that on the basis of your testimony. You're telling me how things appear to you, and of course, you could be lying about that. And the thing is, if each inquirer just relies on appearances to them and ignores appearances to everyone else, then that is not sufficient for anything like science or even philosophy, because science and philosophy are intersubjective disciplines. So that the results that we're getting, I mean, they've got to be available, and the case for them has got to be available to others as well as oneself, and so it's not enough that you have the evidence for a theory. It's got to be that it's evidence which is available to other people as well. And in fact, if you think about the evidence for scientific hypotheses, which is presented in, for example, articles in scientific journals, it's not reports on how things appeared to a particular individual. It's just reports actually on what the results of the experiment were and that sort of thing. The second kind of fallibility of appearances is that we're fallible about past appearances, which is the problem of memory. So I'm certainly fallible about how things appeared to me yesterday, because I might be misremembering. There's absolutely no infallibility there. And so if one was, as we're trying to restrict the evidence to a domain where appearances are or facts about appearances which are about which we're infallible, we just have to restrict ourselves to present appearances. But present appearances are far too little for science or philosophy, because they don't allow the accumulation of evidence in the way that we need it for any kind of systematic inquiry to proceed. Because if we only had our present appearances, as soon as a couple of seconds had gone by, we would have lost them again. So those are two pretty obvious aspects of the fallibility of appearances, and our fallibility about appearances. And so they already suggest that we would have to restrict ourselves to facts, or a given agent would have to restrict themselves to facts about how things appear to them at that very time, which is an extraordinary restriction of evidence. But there's even a further problem of fallibility with evidence, which is that we're fallible even about present appearances to ourselves. And we could, just to give it a name, we could call it the problem of introspection. Because if we're going to use appearances as evidence, which we can use to confront a theory, we're going to have to describe them in language, because the assessment of theories against evidence normally takes place in language. But if we can describe them in language, we can also misdescribe them. and so as once appearances, as it were, are articulated in words in the way that they need to be, because science and philosophy are verbalized, we're no longer infallible about them. I mean, I think, in fact, the infallibility might go even further than this, but those are three fairly clear ways in which appearances do not constitute an infallible source of evidence. And so I think the natural moral to draw here is not just that appearances are not uniquely evidence, but there just are no infallible sources of evidence, that any potential source of evidence is also capable of producing falsehoods. And so we should not be embarking on some kind of hopeless search for infallible sources of evidence, because I think appearances are they're the best shot at such evidence. But we've seen that we're not infallible about them, and that instead of looking for infallible sources of evidence, which we will never find, what we should do is concentrate on cultivating the ability to recognize our mistakes. And in particular cases where we've incorrectly treated something as part of our evidence. And so we accept that it's inevitable that we'll sometimes make mistakes. And what we have to do is to be ready to correct the mistakes afterwards. That's where the methodology needs to come in, not so much in excluding the possibility of error in the original assemblage of evidence, but in being able to correct things when we have made mistakes. We would just accept that we're always going to make some mistakes. Now, we have to be careful here about what kind of recognition of our fallibility and willingness to accept our mistakes, what that involves. What it does not mean is that as soon as someone challenges something we've been using as evidence, we stop using it as evidence. So it's not as though whenever you're taking something as evidence and then somebody asks, are you sure, or what's the reason for accepting that, or whatever, that we then immediately have to stop treating whatever it was as evidence, because if we adopted that policy, it would be very easy for a skeptic to bring science to a complete halt simply by just challenging all our evidence. Because, you know, if we had to stop relying on something as soon as it was challenged, and if all our evidence was challenged, then we'd have nothing to rely on. And so the appropriate kind of readiness to recognize and correct our mistakes has to do with how we react when there are specific and serious doubts about it. So that, as it were, it's not just some kind of generic "how do you know," but where a particular objection is made to the thing that we've been relying on, and then those doubts themselves are going to be based on some kind of evidence, and so they can't work in a way where we just exclude everything from our set of evidence. And what I'm briefly going to do is to sketch very quickly the view of evidence that I defend in Knowledge and Its Limits, because I think this is, in fact, relevant to evidence in philosophy. So the view that I defend is summarized in the equation E equals K, where E stands for evidence and K stands for knowledge. And so the equation is understood as saying that the total content of your evidence is the total content of your knowledge. As well, what your evidence is what you know. And one consequence of this, which I've been kind of hinting at in the way I've been formulating things before, but I haven't yet made explicit, is that since knowledge is always true, evidence is always true. So you can think of evidence here as consisting of facts. And so strictly speaking, there's no such thing as false evidence on this view. And so you might think, well, in that case, how does fallibility enter? But the fallibility is in what we identify as being part of our evidence. And so in cases where we think we know things, which in fact we don't know, then given the equation E equals K, in effect what we're doing is wrongly thinking that these things are part of our evidence when in fact they're not. And so, I mean, so these are cases where we don't know something, but we don't know that we don't know it. And those are also cases where something is not part of our evidence, but we don't know that it's not part of our evidence. There are also arguably cases where something is part of our evidence, but we don't know that it is. These correspond to cases where we know something, but we don't know that we know it. But that's a much subtler issue. And the cases where something is not part of our evidence, maybe because it's false, those are the easiest ones to think about. So given this equation E equals K, everything we know is available for use as evidence in philosophy. And that includes both common sense knowledge and scientific knowledge. So from the point of view of evidence, it's not that common sense knowledge has any special privilege. It's simply that because it's knowledge, it's a source of evidence. But we can use any kind of scientific knowledge that we have as evidence too. So this is a view on which philosophy is not the prior to scientific investigation. It can learn from scientific investigation while still being philosophy. Because this lecture is particularly about the role of common sense, I want to say something about, in particular, the common sense evidence. I think somebody needs to turn off their to mute. By the way, so. Yeah, I think could we have that muted, please? So remember that common sense knowledge was initially rejected as a source of evidence because it's a fallible source, because it can sometimes give us falsehoods. But now we've seen that it's an unreasonable standard to apply to sources of evidence, and so we can go back to treating common sense as a source of evidence, and that's vindicated by the identification of evidence with what we know, because common sense is a source of knowledge. At least let's assume that for the time being. So common sense knowledge, it includes knowledge by perception, preserved by memory, and communicated by testimony. And any kind of knowledge that we have of that kind is, in principle, something that we can use in philosophy, although in the kind of critical way that I've been describing. And there may well be other kinds of common sense knowledge which are acquired by common sense reasoning, and that's something that I'll discuss in lecture 4. But for the time being, we don't need to decide that issue. So I think we still have to address these doubts about common sense, because you might think that we're being too optimistic about common sense as a source of knowledge because we're biased in our own favor. And if you notice that I said that the fact that common sense is fallible doesn't exclude it as a source of evidence. And on the view of evidence that we're now working with, common sense can provide evidence, provided that it supplies us with knowledge. But you remember earlier we were considering more skeptical views of common sense, on which it might just turn out to be a bundle of prejudices, or it might somehow radically misconceive the world. And then if all that it's supplying us with is false, then it's not knowledge. And so after all, common sense will still not be a source of evidence if it's not a source of knowledge. So I think a lot of this kind of skeptical concern is motivated, at least in part, by a fear that we are biased in our own favor, and that the assumption that common sense provides us with a lot of knowledge is, as were, the kind of over-optimistic view that might be part of common sense and might be useful, but without being true. Because remember earlier I was saying that one example of beliefs that can be useful without being true are beliefs of an over-optimistic kind. I mean, it's said that the only people who accurately estimate what others think of them are those who are clinically depressed. That the rest of us who aren't not clinically depressed overestimate how much other people like us and respect us and so on. And so it could be that the overestimation of common sense is itself part of that as over-optimistic, useful but not true conception. And I think that the natural way of dealing with this issue is by thinking of animal common sense. which again would mean the kinds of knowledge or belief that are widespread in groups of animals. Of course, some of the things that I've been saying about common sense don't apply to animals without language. So, for example, the knowledge by testimony, by it's communicated from one animal to another. There's not much of that if you don't have a language. I mean, maybe there's a little bit of that amongst languageless animals because they have alarm cries and so on, and bees communicate something by their dancing, but that's a much less of a phenomenon than with the sort of very, very widespread communication of knowledge by linguistic communication that we find amongst humans. But still, it seems that knowledge acquired by sense perception and then preserved by memory, that is widespread. Well, or at least, let's say, not to beg the question, the common sense beliefs acquired in those ways and preserved in those ways are widespread amongst animals. And I mean, the advantage of considering the case of animals is that we have no special bias in their favor. It's not like humans assessing human cognition. This is humans assessing non-human cognition. So what do we say about that? And I think the natural view here is that for many species of animal, they have a lot of knowledge, of a low-level kind about their local environments. So if we think, for example, of predators and prey, such as cats and mice, or tigers and deer or whatever. So knowledge of each other's whereabouts and of local geography is a matter of life and death. So if you're a mouse, you need to be very aware to have a lot of you need to have knowledge of whether there is any cat around, if there is a cat around, where it is, and so on. And you also need to have knowledge of where the holes are that you can run into to escape from the cat, and so on. And the cat also has to have knowledge like that. It needs knowledge of where the mice are, knowledge of where they might run, and so on. And of course, if we're thinking of domestic cats, then their survival doesn't depend on whether they're good at catching mice. But if we're thinking of big cats in the wild, leopards, lions, tigers, and so on, their survival depends on their ability to hunt successfully, and similarly with all sorts of other predators and prey. And if they have a good awareness of their surroundings, that is, that they know about what's going on about them, then that is crucial both for the predators and their ability to catch prey, and for the prey in their ability to avoid being caught. And this kind of knowledge is knowledge that we postulate and attribute to them in order to explain their behavior. I mean, we can, when we're talking about why the cat is being so cautious and crouching down and so on, it's because the cat knows that there's a mouse in front of it, and it doesn't want to alert the mouse, and so on. And and if we we're talking about why the mouse is running away, maybe because it knows that there's a cat after it. And so, and of course, these kinds of explanations, in particular cases, can get much more detailed and specific about in explaining just why they move in one direction rather than another, and so on. And if someone suggested that we should instead postulate useful but false beliefs that the cat and the mouse have, that seems like a much less good explanation. I mean, in fact, it's not at all clear what these useful but false beliefs would be that explained their behavior, and it would also be not at all clear what the point of attributing them to the cat and the mouse would be. So the natural hypothesis is one which attributes knowledge rather than mere belief to the predators and prey. Of course, I mean, there are many particular situations in which the cats and the mice have false beliefs. They can be tricked. I mean, if the mouse is hiding, the cat may have the false belief that there are no mice around, and if the cat is hiding, then the mice may have the false belief that there's no cat around. But those false beliefs are specific errors, and in fact, in the examples that I was giving, they're in effect the result of specific deceptive strategies or tactics used by the other animals to trick the other side into making a mistake, so that, as it were, where its generally reliable cognitive capacities need to be in some way, as it were, deceived. So when we attribute false beliefs to them, it's really on the basis of specific circumstances in a setting where perhaps the default is to attribute knowledge, and this is some kind of deviation from it. And someone who just refuses to attribute knowledge to non-human animals seems to be misunderstanding the appropriate methodology for attributing mental states. That the best explanations available of the behavior of non-human animals in many cases involves attributing mental states to them, and in fact, in animal ethology, quite complex mental states are often attributed to at least to the higher non-human animals, and this is not, as it were, something sentimental or anthropomorphic in the way that we describe them. It's something that is evolutionarily plausible for the reasons that I explained earlier, that on evolutionary grounds, we'd expect that creatures with minds would acquire a lot of knowledge, because that's what having a mind is for. And I mean, there wouldn't be much point in evolutionary point in having curiosity unless the thing that it's an appetite for, which is knowledge, was fairly readily available. So, and it's also the case that where the best explanation of animal behavior that we have available attributes knowledge, then that's good evidence that they do know. And indeed, it would be in a way unscientific not to attribute knowledge if the effect of not attributing it was that we had to rely on some less good explanation of the animal's behavior. So it seems to me that the overwhelmingly plausible view is that non-human animals have lots of knowledge, or of a modest, fairly specific kind, as were a local kind, and that the kind of knowledge that they typically get is common sense knowledge, or at least knowledge acquired by common sense, but animal common sense methods. And then carrying on from that, if many non-human animals have significant knowledge of their environments, it would be quite extraordinary for humans to lack such knowledge. I mean, of course, it may well be that as humans, we do tend to overestimate our species and to think that we're cognitively more superior to other animals than we really are. But what's utterly implausible is that we are greatly inferior to other species of animal. It seems that, as it were, we're not at the very least, we're not worse than non-human animals in cognitive terms, at least overall. I mean, of course, in specific ways, they're better than we are, like they have better sense of smell. And so, as it were, just on these kind of evolutionary grounds and in comparison with other animals, it seems that the most plausible hypothesis is that we have at least as much knowledge of our environment as non-human animals have of theirs, and so because this is a kind of common sense type of knowledge, it's just scientifically extremely plausible that that human beings have lots of common sense knowledge, and therefore, given the equation of evidence and knowledge, it follows that common sense is a fallible source of evidence for us, and it's evidence that we can use in philosophy as in anything else. Now, of course, that's not some kind of pure a priori argument that the common sense must be a source of knowledge. I mean, there was no transcendental reasoning going on or anything like that. These are considerations, as it were, to reassure ourselves that are, if you like, a posteriori, are based on natural science, in particular, on kind of an evolutionary way of thinking about what's going on. But that's also in line with the picture of philosophy that I've been giving, on which the evidence that we can use in philosophy is everything that we know, not just something that has passed some special test for being a priori. So, and I should also emphasize that the argument that I've given, it's not a necessary condition for having common sense knowledge. I mean, people, long before the theory of evolution, people could, had plenty of common sense knowledge. So, I mean, the common sense knowledge is not obtained by thinking about the theory of evolution. It's obtained just by using our senses and memory and so on in common sense ways. It's rather that we get this common sense knowledge in the common sense ways, but then when we reflect on it and we wonder whether we might be making some error here and that really common sense does not supply us with knowledge, then I think we can reassure ourselves by reflecting that, in fact, there is very good scientific reason to think that human beings have a lot of common sense knowledge. So that's a kind of defense of the fallible role of common sense knowledge as a source of evidence with which we can start doing philosophy, and that continues to be a source of evidence for as long as we do philosophy, because we continue to have this common sense knowledge, which as knowledge is part of our evidence. So just to tell you what's coming in the next lecture, there's a natural connection between common sense and the idea of agreement, because since common sense is what's widespread in the given community, it also tends to be agreed. But it also seems that disagreement and disputation plays a very central role in standard philosophical methodology. And so in the next lecture, I'll be talking about the role of disagreement in philosophy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, for your informative and clear talk. Sebastian have 10 minutes. Fei Duoyi have 5 minutes. Okay, it's your turn.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Chen, for inviting me to give this first comment on the first lecture today, and indeed for organizing this fabulous series of lectures by Professor Williamson. And thanks to Professor Williamson for his great lecture today. Now, I hope you can see my screen, which I'm trying to share with you. This is my presentation. Now, since I find myself in very large agreement with Tim, certainly on the broad outlines of what he has presented, but also I believe on many details, I will try to be brief with my comments and instead try to ask a few questions. One general comment I want to make before I go into those questions is that I think something that Tim's lecture achieves, which I find quite admirable, really, is to give a compelling story of the naturalness of philosophy, just how natural it is to do philosophy, which I think is an important story to tell, because philosophy so often and to so many can seem to be so strange and unnatural. Now, another admirable characteristic of this lecture, connected to the first one I mentioned, is that I believe Tim achieves this compelling story partly by practicing what he preaches. So in telling us this story of the naturalness of philosophy, Tim is, of course, engaging in philosophy, doing philosophy himself. And I believe now the story is so compelling because he manages to do this bit of philosophy in exactly the way in which he says it should be possible, mainly based on common sense and curiosity, explicitly anyway, because I'm sure to arrive at this picture, he will have drawn on his many years of experience of doing philosophy. So now I want to give you mainly 4 questions, if I can control my presentation. Yes. Okay, 4 questions. The questions are, first, what is philosophy? And notice the quotation marks, please. The second question is, what is common sense? Third question is, what follows from comparing proto-science and proto-philosophy? And the fourth question is this: what is a good mixture of common sense and curiosity to cultivate? And now I will try to explain each of these questions, and in that way try to ask them meaningfully. So question 1. What is philosophy? Obviously, that is the big question in the background of this entire lecture series. And so perhaps these quotation marks around the questions should also be understood as scare quotes at the same time. The way in which I want to ask this question is a particular way, and that'll become clear now. So here's something that Professor Williamson says. I will quote him using TW:. He says, abstract definitions of the word philosophy are not very useful. And I certainly agree. Now, I do think that some definitions are somehow useful. So perhaps if he has the time, I would be interested to know just how useless, as it were, he finds such definitions. But I can agree that they are not very useful. And what we are really interested in, if we're interested in definitions, are definitions of the real thing, not the words. But I think that an etymological definition in this case of the word philosophy is often pretty useful. If someone asks you what philosophy is, and you can tell them, well, that the word anyway derives from ancient Greek and means something like love of wisdom, it might tell them something, but obviously not very much, so not very useful. Now, about definitions of philosophy, Professor Williamson has said this: I understand philosophy as a science, but not a natural science. That's clearly short of a precise definition, some sort of abstract definition nonetheless. And I do think this is very useful, and I think that he included it today because it has a certain use, even though much is left to explain. Many people have wondered about the relation between philosophy and science, and so to say that philosophy may be a non-natural science is quite interesting and useful to know, so one knows where Professor Williamson is headed. And now, thinking about this and having read some of his books about philosophy, I had the following question. Because Professor Williamson, you have given something like abstract definitions, or certainly closer to abstract definitions, of some of the things that you have worked on in your career, such as knowledge and vagueness. When I think about your work about knowledge and vagueness, it seems to me much easier to give something like a abstract formulation and perhaps a sort of abstract definition of what you take these things to be. But in your work on philosophy, I believe I can't quite think of such a thing. So I wonder whether you have one, and if not, why not? What might be special about philosophy in this way? The second question is, what is common sense? Clearly an important question, because this lecture was about philosophy and common sense. Now, Professor Williamson told us that he will understand common sense knowledge as widely shared knowledge, common sense belief as widely shared belief, and common sense cognitive methods as, widely shared cognitive methods. When I look at these definitions, I struggle to see just how to understand the notion of common sense as such. I can see how it is related to the explanations, but I can't quite see how all of it is related. So it seems to me that really widely shared knowledge would just be common knowledge. And so I don't quite understand why the notion of common sense is employed by Professor Williamson. And perhaps something was left implicit there, I wondered, and I'm interested to know just how that works. Now, thinking about what that might be, I thought about the German typical translation of common sense, which is gesunder Menschenverstand, which you could translate literally into healthy human reason. Now, Professor Williamson did not want to restrict common sense to humans, though. And indeed, he said that the ingredients for philosophy to get started, common sense and curiosity, can be found in non-human animals too. So he did say a few things about language also, but I wonder just where perhaps he would want to draw the line. And I expressed that question by asking, on your account, given that animals have both ingredients needed to start philosophy, can non-human animals do philosophy too? Now, Professor Williamson answered his question, where does philosophy start, by saying a natural answer is with common sense. And perhaps that is not his final answer, and I'm not sure I understand his final answer. So I ask him whether that is his final answer, or whether perhaps he might want to say something else if he was pressed. Perhaps the story was more specific today. And a small challenge is seeing that he thinks both common sense and curiosity are needed to get started. Thinking about it, it seemed to me, especially given his excellent definition of curiosity as appetite for knowledge, might not curiosity in the sense really be enough, insofar as that an appetite for something would presuppose the relevant bits of knowledge and common sense. Question 3 is a quick question for clarification. Somewhere along the way of his interesting story of the naturalness of philosophy, he talked about proto-science and proto-philosophy. And he said it would be totally unnatural to classify the proto-scientific questions as empirical and the proto-philosophical ones as conceptual. Now, it seemed to me that, of course, he seemed to imply to me that criticism follows here of those people who believe that we can distinguish actual scientific and philosophical questions by saying that the scientific ones are empirical and philosophical questions are conceptual. But it seemed to me that there's an important difference between talking about the proto stage as compared with the post-proto stage, as it were. So even if this classification, which he says is unnatural, is false, it may still be true that the real things, once they are developed further from the proto stage at which the classification, the distinction did not work, maybe later the distinction does apply. And so I wondered just what exactly the intended lesson was regarding science and philosophy, because I do not suppose that Professor Williamson was implying what I think is problematic. So another question for clarification, really. Finally, my question, what is a good mixture of common sense and curiosity to cultivate? And I want to ask this question in the same two ways in which Professor Williamson wanted to ask the question where philosophy gets started, or how, for an individual as well as for a culture. Now, I think that for an isolated individual, it would certainly be true that, following Professor Williamson's picture, the mixture to cultivate would be a more or less even balance. It's as if you have common sense on the one hand, curiosity on the other, and if you develop those into somewhat extreme forms, you could think you have two people having a dispute in your head. There's the defender of common sense, or perhaps you can call that the dogmatist, and there's the one that is, as it were, purely curious, perhaps close to a skeptic. So you have the dogmatist and the skeptic, and you want to mediate between the two, as it were. Now, for an entire culture, and I'll do this very briefly now, it seems that you would want the same. And here the question is whether you want each individual, ideally, to be a balanced philosopher, as it were, or whether you want to allow for different types, as it were, actual dogmatists, actual skeptics, and various other specialists, as it were. And that seems to me to be true about our actual philosophical culture. So what about an individual within a philosophical culture? And we can take our culture that we all share, within which philosophy is a profession where there are many specializations. So the question is, should some people, would it be good for, as it were, the cultural maximization of philosophical knowledge, that some people develop into some extreme types of mixture of common sense and curiosity in cultivating their philosophical talent, so as to be something closer to skeptics and others something closer to dogmatists? And in general, is there value in having both specialists and generalists, or perhaps should we have only generalists? Thank you.
Hello, Professor Williamson. Thank you for your informative and insightful speech. I'm very inspired. Now, I'd love to know a little more about your ideas. I'd like to ask 2 questions. Question 1. If I understand you correctly, you agree that common sense is usually used in 3 different ways. The first, as indicating fundamental knowledge. The second, as a summary term for common values, which serves as the premise of the rationality of behavior. The third, as a thinking framework that is used by people to talk about the concepts, categories, and ways of the world. Therefore, the scope of common sense involves metaphysics, epistemology, and practical philosophies. As far as metaphysics is concerned, how can the errors of common sense be corrected through philosophy? For example, we take beliefs such as the existence of the outside world as a presupposition of philosophy. But why do we think that what is obvious is not an illusion? Could you please tell us what role philosophy can play in this process, or why philosophy can overturn common sense? That's the first question. It also brings me to the second question. Question 2. Both science and philosophy pursue breaking through common sense. The breakthrough of science to common sense is realized in the common sense world, which can be seen as the soil that nourishes science. Like science, the only world which philosophy faces can only be that of common sense. Then, what is the essential difference between the breakthrough of common sense from philosophy and that from science? I wonder if you would like to explain this point. That's all for my 2 questions. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for those interesting questions, and I'll say something to answer them, taking the 2 speakers in order. So first of all, with Sebastian, and his first question was, what is philosophy, but in quotation marks, and he was asking me a little bit more about, pressing me about why I'm so resistant to giving a definition. I don't really think that the suggested etymological one, the from Plato, the love of wisdom, is very helpful. I mean, whether if that's the right translation is not terribly. I mean, in particular with wisdom, I think it's not very clear. I mean, wisdom in in English now often refers to something very practical. I mean, you go to a wise person who will give you advice about how to make a difficult decision, and the wisdom of that person may just consist in their ability to know what the best thing to do is in a variety of situations, but not because they have any, as it were, general theory about it, or and it may be very, very particular and practical. And I think that although wisdom in that sense is important, but I don't think it has very much to do with philosophy, and I don't think that love of it has very much to do with philosophy. And my suspicion is also that there are probably quite a lot of people who are good philosophers but don't particularly love wisdom. They love something else, and maybe something cognitive still, or maybe it's even possible to do philosophy pretty well if what you love is for example, to become well known and have lots of people reading your books or something. I mean, that doesn't automatically mean that the books are bad. And I mean, in the case of in the case of vagueness, I really just I give a rough definition of it in terms of borderline cases, but the borderline cases themselves are only explained by reference to examples. And in the case of knowledge, I mean, my view is that knowledge cannot be defined in more basic terms. I mean, I think also in the one specific thing about philosophy, which is different both from knowledge and vagueness, in that it's connected with a very specific intellectual tradition. I mean, the term is connected. Is that to some extent it's defined by the historical accidents about what is done in philosophy departments. I mean, departments called philosophy departments. And, I think, for example, if you think about the borders of philosophy with other subjects, I mean, there's just a continuum, for example, from philosophy of physics to theoretical physics. And there's no particular point at which it's at all natural to say, now people are doing physics, they're not doing philosophy, or vice versa. So I don't think a definition there would be very helpful. On question 2, what is common sense? Of course, the English phrase common sense has quite an odd history, because it goes back to Aristotle's notion of common sense, which had to do with things that were not specific to any one of the 5 ordinary senses. And of course, that isn't a very helpful way of thinking about common sense as the notion is now understood. Really, what I wanted to emphasize was that the fact that no specialist knowledge is required to get started with philosophy, that it can be done on the basis of the kind of cognitive resources that a normal human being will have. On the specific question of whether non-human animals can do philosophy, I mean, I think the implied answer was, well, probably not, because at least if we're talking about the species that happen to be on Earth at the moment, the non-human ones don't really have language in any but a very, very rudimentary sense. And I was suggesting that language is needed to ask the kind of questions which are proto-philosophical. And so I think non-human animals just don't have the cognitive resources even to ask those questions, let alone to answer them. On whether curiosity is enough to get philosophy started, well, if you didn't have common sense, I don't think you could get anywhere asking these questions. And I think a being that didn't have common sense would be radically, a human that didn't have it would be radically cognitively deprived. So, I was talking about what in practice is needed. Whether you could have a being that had, whether it's, as it were, metaphysically possible to have a being that has curiosity but no common sense, I'm not sure. But so I wasn't meaning to exclude that possibility. But it might have other kinds of knowledge. But in normal human terms, I think that we do need some kind of common sense as well as curiosity to get anywhere with philosophy. For question 3, what follows from comparing proto-science and proto-philosophy? I think, as I understand your main point, it was that even if, as we're at the proto level, that there is no difference in kind between these two classes of question, it could still be true that philosophy, as it subsequently developed, went in a direction such that its questions became conceptual questions and were of a radically different kind from those asked in science. And I agree that that's a possibility. All I was doing was some sort of provisional softening up, saying that if we just look at the kind of questions that philosophy and science begin with, it's totally unnatural to impose such a division on them. And so, as it were, our default expectation is that even as they develop, they don't head off in radically different directions, because after all, we still recognize those questions as proto-philosophical ones or proto-scientific ones. And so I think the initial presumption is against there being any such radical difference between science and philosophy. But of course, that is not a conclusive refutation of the idea that there is. But for that, we have to look much more closely at that sort of view of philosophy. And that's something I'll be doing, for example, in lecture 3. Finally, about the question 4, what is a good mixture of common sense and curiosity to cultivate? The way that issue was set up, it was a little bit as if there was a kind of trade-off between common sense and curiosity, that the more common sense you have, the less curious you are, and vice versa. I don't really accept that. I think that it's often the case that the more common sense people have, the more curious they are. So that, as it were, increasing common sense doesn't have to mean decreasing curiosity, and vice versa. I think you were aligning, as it were, the skeptic with the curiosity, and the dogmatist with the common sense. My experience of people with skeptical inclinations is actually that they're extremely dogmatic in their arguments and are lacking in curiosity. And I think it's not surprising, because the skeptic thinks that we can't have knowledge, and so it's pointless to have an appetite for it. Okay, I mean, those are very summary sorts of answers to the questions, and of course, there's more to be said, but that will have to do because of the time limitations, and so now I briefly want to respond to Fei Duoyi's questions, which were, so the first question I think had to do with the capacity of science and philosophy to overturn common sense, and the second to do with the difference between the way in which philosophy might overturn it and the way in which science or natural science might overturn it. So I think that although common sense is a considerable source of knowledge, there's no particular, as it were, I mean, there's no telling in advance which bits of common sense may turn out to be false. And I mean, what I would say is that when bits of common sense are overturned by philosophy or science, the philosophy that happens because the philosophy or science itself has is a theory with a very strong evidential base, which then turns out to be inconsistent with some bit of common sense, and the evidential base for the theory ultimately, in some way or other, goes back to common sense cognitive capacities. So that, I mean, it's not exactly that common sense is being inconsistent with itself, but that that common sense methods, when they're applied systematically and carefully enough, can lead to the rejection of bits of common sense. Of course, I mean, the methods then have to be developed maybe over centuries in ways which make them very distant from common sense, but nevertheless, they did have some kind of root from there. And on the difference between the way that common sense can be broken by philosophy and the way it can be broken by science, I'm not sure that there is very much of a difference there. I think in both cases, what's going on is that both philosophy and science produce theories which are strongly confirmed on the basis of evidence, and then they reveal that something that we had taken to be a piece of common sense knowledge is actually false. And although there are, if one looks at particular cases, there may be all sorts of contrasts, I don't think that fundamentally there's any kind of radical difference of kind. I mean, I don't think, for example, that in one case it's that philosophy is showing that our concepts are confused, whereas in another case, it's that the science is showing that it doesn't match experience or something like that. I don't think there is any general distinction of a deep kind between the way that common sense, in particular cases, can be criticized by philosophy and can be criticized by science. I'm afraid I think I have to stop there because we're running out of time. But those were good questions, and there would certainly be room for much more discussion of them. And so thank you very much for asking them.